Hi, hello everyone. Welcome back to my channel. Today we will learn about absurdism. Absurdism emerged in the 1940s and they solidified in the early 1950s. Absurdism is a philosophical and literary movement that explores the conflict between the human desire to find inherent meaning in life and the silent, indifferent universe that offers none. Rooted in existentialist philosophy, it represents the human condition as fundamentally irrational, meaningless, and often tragically comic. This is reflected in absurdist literature, where traditional plot, character, and language structures are deliberately subverted to dramatize the absurdity of existence. Philosophical origins of absurdism. The roots of absurdism lie in existentialism, particularly in the aftermath of World War II, when the atrocities and disillusionments of modern life raised the questions about meaning, morality, and a human purpose. Albert Camus is credited with formulating the philosophy of the absurd in his 1942 essay, The Myth of Sisyphus. He argued that life is inherently meaningless, but we must continue living with this awareness, much like Sisyphus eternally rolling a boulder up a hill. Definition of absurdist literature. Absurdist literature dramatizes the philosophical concept of absurdity through characters caught in meaningless routines, circular dialogues, non-linear narratives, and surreal settings. It often features non-traditional plot structures, illogical or dream-like events, incoherent or repetitive language, disoriented characters with no clear goals or explanations, a mixture of comedy and a tragedy. Historical development. Early 20th century seeds. Dadaism and surrealism influenced the absurdist aesthetics with the rebellion against logic and reason. Post-World War II core development, 1940s to 1960s. The theatre of the absurd, coined by Martin Esslin, 1961, emerged as a powerful literary theatrical movement. Contemporary influence. Influenced modernist and postmodernist literature, cinema, for example, Samuel Beckett adaptation, then Charlie Kaufman's films, and post-structuralist philosophy. Social and political context. The rise of absurdism is closely linked to World War II devastation, existential despair in a fragmented, disillusioned society, the collapse of religious or metaphysical certainties, alienation in modern urban or bureaucratic life. It reflected a crisis of faith in language, institutions, and logic itself. Importance of absurdism in literature and language. Absurdist literature deconstructed traditional narrative techniques. It questioned whether language can meaningfully represent reality, whether literature can convey coherent truths. It opened space for metafiction, postmodern fragmentation, non-linear storytelling, existential introspection through form. Now let's analyze major absurdist writers and the works. Albert Camus from France, the book The Myth of Sisyphus 1942, an essay outlining absurdist philosophy. The Stranger 1942, an existential novel illustrating moral absurdity. The next work, Caligula, The Plague. The next writer, Franz Kafka, Austria-Hungary, Czech lands. Works include The Metamorphosis, 1915, The Trial, 1925, The Castle, 1926. Kafka's work a prefigure absurdism with a bureaucratic nightmares and alienated protagonists. The next writer, Samuel Beckett from Ireland. Works include Waiting for Godot, 1953, a seminal absurdist play where nothing happens. Endgame, 1957. Then a next work, Crab's Last Thief and Happy Days, known for his minimalist language and a cyclical structure. The next writer is Eugene Ionesco, Romania, France. His works include The Bald Soprano, 1950, Rhinoceros, 1959, The Chairs, 1952. Satirized the banality and breakdown of language. The next writer is Jean Genet from France. His works include The Maids, 1947, The Balcony, 1956. He explored identity, power, and illusion through grotesque theatricality. The next writer, Harold Pinter from UK. His works include The Birthday Party, 1957, The Dumb Waiter, 1957. Used the pauses, silence, and ambiguity to reflect the existential menace. The next writer, Tom Stoppard from UK. Works Rosencrantz and Guildenstern Are Dead, 1966. Absurdist retelling of Hamlet from the point of view of minor characters. Now let's analyze the key concepts and themes associated with the absurdist literature. Meaninglessness, that is the quest for meaning in a world that resists explanation. Alienation, characters are often isolated and disconnected. Repetition and routine, circular time, senseless activity, futility. Breakdown of communication, language becomes meaningless or contradictory. Dark comedy, humor arises from despair, contradiction, or failure. Now let's analyze absurdism's relation to other literary movements. Existentialism. Absurdism shares themes but it rejects the idea of finding authentic meaning. For example, Sartre versus Camus. Modernism. Absurdist literature inherits the fragmentation and experimentation of modernism. Postmodernism builds on absurdism with a metafiction, parody, and a narrative disintegration. Surrealism both favor illogical or dream-like imagery. Dadaism shares the rebellion against reason and conventions. Let's analyze the contemporary relevance of absurdism. Absurdism remains highly relevant in an era of information overload, political chaos, climate anxiety, philosophical relativism. The movement resonates with the younger generations, confronting uncertainty and existential questions in a digital, post-truth societies. Absurdist literature offers a stark, sometimes humorous, but almost profound mirror to the human condition in the modern world. Its rejection of conventional storytelling is not merely stylistic, but a deeply philosophical, a reflection of humanity's eternal confrontation with the irrational, unpredictable, and meaningless aspects of existence. It continues to shape global literature, theatre, cinema, and a critical theory. Now let's analyze the major absurdist works. First one, Waiting for Godot by Samuel Beckett. Two tramps, namely Blarney and Stragan, wait endlessly for a man named Godot who never arrives, embodying the futility and the repetition of human existence. The play explores themes of existential despair, meaningless time, and the fragility of hope. Minimal action and a cyclical dialogue emphasize the absurdity of waiting for meaning in a seemingly indifferent universe. The next work, The Myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus. Camus retells the Greek myth of Sisyphus, condemned to push a boulder uphill forever, as a metaphor for the human condition. He argues that life's absurdity does not warrant a suicide, but invites a defiant embrace of life without illusion. Sisyphus becomes a symbol of dignity in struggle, even in a meaningless world. The next work, The Bald Soprano by Eugene Ionesco. In this Andy play, Mr. and Mrs. Smith engage in nonsensical conversations with another couple, the Martins, highlighting the breakdown of language and communication. The characters talk past each other, repeating cliches and non sequesters. Ionesco satirizes the emptiness of bourgeoisie conventions and the absurdity of everyday social rituals. The next work is Endgame by Samuel Beckett. An aging blind man named Ham and a servant club engage in cryptic routines in a post-apocalyptic world, accompanied by Ham's legless parents in dustbins. The play explores decay, dependency, and the paralysis of habit. Beckett probes existential stasis and the tragicomedy of enduring a purposeless life. The next work, Rhinoceros by Eugene Ionesco. Citizens of a French town begin transforming into rhinoceros, symbolizing mass conformity and the rise of totalitarian ideologies. Beringer, the reluctant hero, resists the transmission and chooses to remain human, albeit alone. The play critiques the loss of individuality and a moral responsibility in a conformist society. The next work is The Trial by Franz Kafka. Joseph K. is arrested by a mysterious authority for an unspecified crime and is trapped in a surreal bureaucratic nightmare. Kafka explores the absurdity of modern systems, the inaccessibility of justice, and existential guilt. The novel's logic-defying narrative creates a world where meaning and clarity are forever elusive. The next work, The Castle by Franz Kafka. A land surveyor named K attempts to gain access to the mysterious authorities of a castle who govern a village with inscrutable rules. He is met with endless delays, contradictory information, and a cold indifference. The novel highlights alienation, the absurdity of authority, and the futile quest for acceptance. The next work, The Chairs by Eugene Ionesco. An elderly couple prepares for a speech to be delivered to an invisible audience in an increasingly crowded room filled with empty chairs. They await a speaker who turns out to be a deaf mute, rendering their final effort at a communication meaningless. The play dramatizes the absurdity of legacy, memory, and the human urge for validation. The next work, The Plague by Albert Camus. Set in the Algerian city of Oran, a deadly plague forces the residents to confront suffering, death, and the indifference of nature. Dr. Rex, The narrator chooses to resist the despair and fight the plague, reflecting Camus' philosophy of the absurd and revolt. The novel functions as both a literal epidemic and a metaphor for moral and existential crisis. The next work is The Birthday Party by Harold Pinter. Stanley, a reclusive pianist, lives in a boarding house where two strangers, namely Goldberg and McCann, arrive and subject him to vague but a terrifying interrogation. The play's ambiguity, sinister tone, and a lack of clear motivation evoke a nightmarish world of arbitrary persecution. Harold Pinter illustrates how language and silence can both obscure and enforce power. The next work, The Caretaker by Harold Pinter. A man named Davis, a homeless man, is taken in by Aston, and later threatened by Anston's brother Mick, leading to a shifting dynamic of power and manipulation. The play examines human loneliness, identity, and the fragile illusions we create for stability. Harold Pinter's use of poses and unsaid meaning heightens the sense of absurd isolation. The next work, No Exit, by Jean-Paul Sartre. Three deceased characters, namely Gazin, Ines, and Estelle, find themselves locked in a room together, realizing over time that they are each other's torturers. Sartre dramatizes his existential idea that hell is other people, as the characters are forced to confront their past actions and self-deceptions. The play underscores freedom, responsibility, and the absurdity of human interaction. The next work, The Zoo Story by Edward Albee. In a central part, the emotionally disturbed character, Jerry, confronts the complacent character, Peter, in a tense, ultimately violent encounter. Jerry's monologue about isolation and his provocative behavior reveal his deep existential anguish. The play critiques social alienation and the failure of communication in urban life. The next work, Wojciech by George Buchner. Wojciech, a poor soldier, subjected to medical experiments and betrayal, descends into madness and murders his lover. The fragmented structure and bleak vision prefigure modern absurdist themes. The play explores dehumanization, mental illness, and the brutal effects of poverty and powerlessness. The next work is The Trial of Lucullus by Bertolt Brecht. Roman general named Lucullus faces judgment in the underworld, where his military exploits are weighed against his contribution to human culture. The play deconstructs heroism and critiques the glorification of war. Brecht's epic theatre aligns with the absurdist concerns about a moral ambiguity and a historical memory. The next work, The American Dream by Edward Albee. A grotesque satire of American family values, the play features the characters named Mommy, Daddy, and a grandma in a surreal domestic setting, culminating in the arrival of a young man, a hollow symbol of modernity. Albee critiques consumerism, emasculation, and the emptiness behind the cultural ideals. The absurdity lies in exaggerated banality and a perverse normalcy. The next work, Happy Days by Samuel Beckett. The character Winnie, buried to her waist and later to her neck in a mound of earth, clings to routines and optimism despite her entrapment. Her incessant chatter contrasts with her mute husband Willy's silence, illustrating isolation and the human need for meaning. Beckett explores the absurd perseverance of hope amid inexorable decay. The next work, The Killer by Lijin Lakshmanan. Baranka, a recurring Ionesco character, encounters an ideal city plagued by a mysterious killer who destroys beauty and harmony. His attempts to reason with or understand the killer fail, representing the impotence of logic against senseless destruction. The play implies existential despair and humanity's vulnerability to violence. The next work, Act Without Words 1. Samuel Beckett. In this wordless mime, a man is stranded in a desert where objects are lowered and pulled away just out of reach. The repetitive futile attempts at achieving comfort reveal the cruelty of unseen forces and the absurdity of existence. Beckett reduces life to action and a reaction in a void of meaning. The next work, How Much Land Does a Man Need? By Leo Tolstoy. The character named Packham, a peasant, is promised as much land as he can encircle in a day, but his greed leads to his death by exhaustion. Though Tolstoy's tale is rooted in Christian morality, its existential undertone, that is, man's endless striving for more in a finite world, aligns with the absurdist themes. It critiques the illusion of control and the futility of material ambition.